Um, Good day, good afternoon, everyone from all over the world, wherever it is you're joining us from. My name is Catherine and Guy, and it's my pleasure to moderate this meeting today on such a critical topic. Okay, yes. Sorry, we had a bit of an interruption, but everything is clear now. So I was saying it's my pleasure to moderate this meeting today on such a critical topic. And I would like to take this moment to appreciate all our speakers and panelists, and also to appreciate the richness of the audience that we have here today. The audience today includes persons who are almost as knowledgeable and even, quite experienced as those speaking. And so we expect a lively debate today. We encourage you to engage and interact in the chat and the question and answer channels that are available. We would also like to let you know that we have simultaneous translation provided by the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. For this reason, we would please ask speakers and panelists to speak slowly and audibly so that the translation would also go smoothly. I would now turn to our host for today, the president and founder of White Institute for Strategy and Education Research, Brigadier General Salih Bala, retired, to set the tone and welcome us to this meeting. General Bala, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. Our distinguished special guests, speakers, panelists, and participants. It gives me great pleasure to have the privilege of hosting you to this important table to join in the debate over global concerns on the increased narrowing of the gap between our policing and military forces in both state and non-state responses to security challenges. While the concern over militarization of policing predates the current millennium, the increase being witnessed recently at a time the global community should be better at the observation of rule of law, human rights, and general civility causes much concern. A critic had asked me why our usage of the word policing rather than police in our title. I responded to the fact that policing is to the act in its whole of society reality than to the focus on the police as an institution. It is therefore the wholesome service delivery system that this roundtable seeks to evaluate. An interesting reality supported by empirical evidence for some developing nations shows that 70% of law and order provisioning is delivered by non-state actors who themselves are more than in civil law terms. The problems thrown up by the activity of mostly unregulated community-based armed groups is a matter of great concern. The concern most of all has been over the human rights violations in the closing gap of techniques, tactics, and procedures of the military and police, which are supposed to be distinct from each other, yet complementary in certain special circumstances. The arguments to the pros and cons, also, if we are not to see a to the days of the early history of organized states, forces that enforce law and order are not the same as those used to prosecute war. Meaning the centurions that fight the wars, that keep law and order in the city-states, are the same that go to fight back. Galaxy of persons from various professional fields, as well as academics and other members of civil society, who have lent us time from their busy schedules to speak to the global audience that we have gathered here. I must appreciate them for the time and interest. I must thank particularly Mr. Luis Carrillo, the UN Police Advisor, for accepting our invitation to deliver the opening speech personally, in spite his high status and busy official schedule. Mr. Carrillo, we are aware that you may not the program until its conclusion, as you may depart at some time to attend other important appointments. But we will really wish you would the end with us. Thank you, Sam, for early morning sacrifice to speak to us. Without saying any more, it is my honor to welcome you all to the table on behalf of the Board of Trustees, Academic Board, and staff of the White Ink Institute for Strategy, Education, and Research, which we call WISER for short. Here is now wishing us all a successful deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you, General Bala, for those welcoming remarks. It is my pleasure to now invite Commissioner Luis Carrillo to give his opening speech. Commissioner Carrillo has more than 34 years of national and international policing experience. As United Nations Police Advisor in November 2017, he was seconded as United Nations Police Commissioner in 3 United Nations peacekeeping operations in the multidimensional integrated stabilization mission in the Central African Republic, in the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Haiti, and in the United Nations Integrated Mission in Timor-Leste. He first joined the United Nations in 1996, where he served in the United Nations in Bosnia and Herzegovina, before joining the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor. That was from 2000 to 2001. Commissioner Luis, my pleasure, pleased to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. And first of all, let me thank the White Ink Institute for Strategy, Education and Research, WISER, in the person of General Bala. Thank you very much. And also, of course, DICAF on the person of Mark Downs. But let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for the invitation, and I am very honored. I would like also to salute all the panelists and all the listeners all over the world. Of course, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to join you today for this important and very timely discussion. The United Nations Police of the Office of the Rule of Law and Security Institutions within the Department of Peace Relations occupy a unique role among the world's police, with about 11,000 women and men from more than 90 countries serving on the front lines in 14 peace operations across the globe. We provide direct operational support to host state police and other law enforcement agencies, as well as help build and develop their capacity to assume these responsibilities themselves. From large multi-dimensional peacekeeping operations like Central African Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Darfur, to smaller political missions like Colombia, now Haiti, and also in Yemen. In rare circumstances, we have been mandated to substitute for host state capacity United Nations had full responsibility and the visible representatives of the UN in the countries where we are deployed. We assist host state authorities to maintain law and order, protect civilians, and engage with local populations. With human rights mainstream, foremost, every United Nations police officer is a human rights officer. While policing has traditionally stood at the nexus of justice and security, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted our critical role at the nexus between public security and public health. As first responders, we cannot telecommute. In addition to our core mandated tasks, our support to host state has expanded to include awareness raising, provision of personal protecting equipment, assistance with contact tracing and decontamination, and of course, the delivery of medical supplies. United Nations police typically serve as either individual police officers or as part of foreign police units. We saw the first deployments of foreign police units at the end of the 90s, and today there are currently 47 FPUs in 5 peacekeeping operations. At this juncture, a tribute to Nigeria, of course, also definitely being the evolution of United Nations police first years ago in response to the growing demands placed on peace, where in some contexts there has been or to enable policy as based context of less operating environment, our questions have remained the same. And investigation of crime, the protection of persons and property, and the maintenance of public order and safety. Let me emphasize that foreign police units are not military units. They provide essential agility and support in instances where foreign police response is required, such as the protection of civilians, the most vulnerable, like children, women, elderly, displaced persons, refugees, public management. For the United States, is the that to be carried only by members of police or other agencies within a legal framework based on the rule of law. Ensuring this can be extremely challenging for an international police service where we have thousands of officers coming from different countries and policing cultures, and where these UN police officers are tasked to assist host state police officers most cases being conscripted as war-fighting soldiers to return to serving their communities as professional police personnel. To ensure more coherent approaches to the provision of public security, police reform and assistance to host state police services, we have developed with member states and partners the strategic guidance framework for international policing, or SGF, which serves as a blueprint for our support that is internationally accepted, human rights compliant, gender responsive, evidence based. Further, with the United Nations Office of the Military Affairs, United Nations Police have developed guidelines on combined military global policing responses, and United Nations, whether ensuring the safety and rights of vulnerable populations in human rights cities of today, or coordinating police planning and action across multiple jurisdictions in the mega cities of tomorrow. Let me conclude by urging all of us to recommit to investing international police, working together to reinforce our credibility, relevance, and impact on the lives of the community we are sworn to protect and serve. I'm looking forward to listen to the discussions, and once again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you, Commissioner Louise. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. And we are grateful to you and the work of the United Nations Police in helping to keep a better and safer society. And in your presentation, I think you have already touched on an important issue that I'm hoping we're going to delve in a lot more today. And this is the issue of the culture of policing. From your presentation, you spoke about the fact of bringing together thousands of police officers from different countries, coming from different policing cultures, and making them align to a particular United Nations standard of policing. And I think that this is incredible. From your presentation, you highlighted right people, right training, right instructors, and the right issues covered. I think that these are some of the topics that we're going to delve in a little bit more as we continue this conversation. To take us next, I'm going to invite General Abdulrahman Dambazal.
Also, I want to say it's good to be here. Now, going straight to the subject matter on global police manifestation of militarization of policing, a necessity or convenience. Now, militarization is a global phenomenon, but varies in degree and extent from one country to another. There are various definitions and descriptions of militarization of policing that have come across. But like in this context, to adopt that of Kraska 2007, who has done extensive research on the subject matter and also explain the blurry distinction between police and military institutions and between war and law enforcement. So for Kraska, to militarize means adopting the central elements of the military model, to an organization or a particular situation. So this is very interesting for me because this military application of this military model is to an organization and to a particular situation. So this is why I looked at it from two levels of militarization of police. On one level is the institutional militarization. In this case, law enforcement agents adopt military-grade weapons and equipment, military mindset, military subculture, regimentation, training, and tactics. As a matter of fact, Section 4 of the Police Act and Regulations includes as part of the duties of the police, Nigerian police, I quote, performance of such military duties within and outside Nigeria as may be required of them. So this is, in essence, institutional militarization. Then there's the situational militarization. This is a situation whereby the military takes over the role of the police, relegating the police to a secondary role. Kraska refers to such a situation as politicization of the military. Such situation has become almost permanent in the 6 states of Nigeria, either military operating standalone or leading one task force or another. Now let's look at the militarization of policing debate. Identify four perspectives in this respect. The first, the emerging threats perspective. This perspective justifies militarization of policing due to emerging threats such as terrorism, violent extremism, drug cartels, etc. And we can add in our own case here in Nigeria, violent militancy and piracy, armed banditry, kidnapping, and violent intercommunal conflicts, etc. Then there's the human rights perspective. For this perspective, militarization of police has the potential for human rights abuses because of the lethal weapons in the hands of law enforcement officials. I would want to refer to Maslow's psychology of the law of the instrument, which states that, and I quote, it is tempting if the only tool you have is a hammer to treat everything as if it were a nail, unquote. That access to a certain tool increases the possibility or probability that the tool is used for problems when other tools may be more appropriate. That militarized policing environment has a tendency to see the potential lawbreaker or actual criminal, as a matter of fact, as enemy. I've come across law enforcement agencies using military templates to indicate friendly forces versus enemy forces as subheadings for their operations. Then the UN Human Rights has produced a guide on the use of less lethal weapons by law enforcement officials as dangerous alternative to firearms. Although this guide, in my own opinion, may be more suitable for post-conflict peace-building environment. Now, this conflict resolution perspective. In this perspective, militarization of policing becomes possible due to failure in conflict resolution. When conflicts are not resolved in their infancy, they grow to the level that normal policing by law enforcement officials becomes problematic. The perennial indigenous settler disputes, the hardest farmers' conflicts in Nigeria are examples. When perpetrators of violence go unpunished, and when victims are not compensated, conflicts escalate. Now, the fourth perspective is public-centric perspective. We can refer to Sir Robert Peel, one-time British Prime Minister, and also described as the father of modern policing, who, while emphasizing the relationship between the public and the police, concluded that the police are the public and the public are the police. The first of Peel's 9 principles of policing is, I quote, to prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. So even at that time, Peel was aware of the possibility of using military force in order to prevent crime and disorder, which was not appropriate. That militarization of policing has the potential to create panic, fear, and distrust among the public, mainly because of cultural shift in law enforcement's view of its role from that of the guardian of society to that of a warrior. Now let's examine situations that lead to militarization of policing. First, when nations perceive escalation of threats or emerging threats to national security. We have seen this argument as the core of militarization debates. Next, as a result of regime security, particularly in dictatorships, weak or flawed democracies, repressive regimes, etc. Some of the examples I can cite is South Africa's apartheid regime, or during the civil rights movement period in the 1960s in the US, or the Chinese government's response to students' youth uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989, or the Israel Defense Forces against Palestinian uprisings. These are a few examples. The next situation is the impact of military rule. In this situation, politics is militarized and the military politicized. The impact of Nigeria's approximately 30 years of military on policing is one such example. When the military is providing aid to civil authority is another situation that invites militarization of policing. And in our case, Section 217, subsection 2, subsection C of the Nigerian Constitution makes provision for that. Another situation could be when law enforcement agencies lack the capacity or capability to carry out their responsibilities due to poor equipment and training, lack of professionalism and or discipline, and institutional corruption, either singly or in combination. This is one likely situation. Or as a consequence of colonial legacy, examples, gendarmes in Francophone countries. And of course, here in Nigeria, the police and the army are offshoots of colonial legacies that were created in 1861 in colony of Lagos. When a nation redistributes or transfers excess military weapons and equipment is another example to the police, such as the 1033 program in the US. There are researchers who proved the relationship between military transfers and violent behavior and found a positive and statistically significant relationship between 1033 transfers and fatalities from officer-involved shootings across all models. Now, what are the challenges of militarization of policing? First, in my opinion, there's not much data or empirical research, particularly in Nigeria and of course most developing countries, to determine the efficacy of militarization of policing, as whether it enhances public safety, deters criminal violence, protects citizens' lives and properties, and protects the law enforcement agencies themselves. Second challenge is that militarization of policing attracts duplication of efforts and wastage of resources. And I think this is straightforward. The third challenges I identify is the militarization of policing contributes to the proliferation of firearms. This is also straightforward. Now, another challenge I see is the likely conflict in the use of discretion in a militarized situation where there are combined or joint operations. The exercise of the widest discretion in the police rests with the constable, while for the military, the soldier relies on superior orders. Likewise, due to the level of training, education, and exposure. The exercise of this enormous amount of discretion wisely by the constable in many developing countries, while not only heavily armed with military-grade weapons and equipment, but also charged with military mindset, is highly risky. Necessity or convenience? From my presentation, I think both necessity and convenience have been applicable. The situations leading to militarization of policing clearly support this conclusion. However, there is need to separate situations in which such militarization of policing is not warranted, such as demonstrations, protests, riots by unarmed citizens. In this case, using less lethal weapons will be most appropriate. But where non-state actors or violent criminals employ military-grade weapons, threatening security and welfare of citizens, then militarization of policing will be justified. In conclusion, whether policing is militarized or not, we should not miss the purpose of policing society itself. That is to enforce the law, maintain order, prevent and control crime in society. In doing so, policing must take cognizance of the following. 1, protection of fundamental human rights of all citizens, whenever, wherever, and however policing is conducted. 2, protect the lives and properties of all citizens against any criminal or violent threats existing or emerging. Strengthening of police-public relations to reinforce public support, trust, and confidence, without which there cannot be effective and efficient law enforcement. Then ensuring that policing is subjected to democratic control for accountability, transparency, and the rule of law. Finally, I think the criminal justice system must be responsive by ensuring that perpetrators of criminal violence are processed duly in accordance with the law and if found guilty, punished, while victims should be duly compensated. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, General Dambazal, for your presentation. Thank you so much for spotlighting some of the issues. Please, before I let you off, I would ask you a question, which I'm hoping you can answer in just a minute or two. And this question is, one of the issues you mentioned in your presentation, sir, is that the militarization of policing leads to a cultural shift in law enforcement's role in society from guardian to that of a warrior. You also mentioned that this culture of law enforcement, especially in some of our countries, flow from our colonial past and our experience with military rule. And I'm just wondering, sir, this warrior culture, can you say that it's in fact entrenched and not necessarily in response to circumstances, such as the weather convenience or necessity, but it's just a reflection of a culture that has been on for so long? My question is, what kind of reform can change culture? And I would want you to answer that question, speaking briefly to your experience as Nigeria's Minister of Interior, and if there was anything you did in that position to change culture in that sense. Please, in just a minute or two, sir. Thank you.
He's muted.
General Dambazal, you would have to unmute your mic, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I think the issue of the transformation of this from that of the guardian to that of a warrior, of course, is a general perception when there is disconnect between the public police One way to deal with that is just to ensure that the police has the required training, the required equipment, the required welfare to be able to carry out its responsibilities as required by the Constitution. But of course, like I have mentioned earlier, the fact that we have situations in which are deadly in terms of criminal violence, in terms of terrorism, whereby in some instances the police are equipped in a way that they look more like the military and they even act like the military. This makes, reinforce that perception as if the police are more like soldiers, not police. But there's a difference between being a police and being a soldier. And that difference is what we should be able to emphasize. So we have the option of ensuring that we restrict police to its constitutional responsibility, primary constitutional responsibility, so that we do not allow police to go into issues that have to do with military. I've mentioned the Police Act itself, whereby one of the duties indicated for the police is that of military duties. And I think this is a follow-up from what has been inherited from the colonial administration. And that, I will delve that into the issue of colonial legacy. Yes, the Nigerian police and the Nigerian army were created almost the same time. So they have the same roots. The intention of the colonial administration was not actually to protect lives and properties of the people, but to protect colonial interests. And of course, after the colonial administration left, we had independence in 1960. We found ourselves, after a few years in military rule. Of course, under military rule, what is obtainable in a democracy is not obtainable in military rule. Yes. So that yes, the same trend you find, inherited from colonial matters, we did not have the opportunity to restructure the police, to reform the police. So I would say that since then the police has been in transition. So there has never been time to restructure the police, to reform the police.
Okay,
so
sir.
The best way to do that is to ensure that the police is reformed in a way that it should be able to carry out its constitutional responsibility.
Thank you.
With clear mandate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, sir. Thank you so much for that response. And I think that leads us straight to our next speaker, Mr. Solomon Arase, who was the former Inspector General of Police in Nigeria. Mr. Solomon Arase, the conversation is on police in transition, and would like to welcome you to share your thoughts. The former Inspector General of Police, Mr. Solomon Arase. Time for your presentation now, sir. Mr. Solomon Arase, sorry. Mr. Solomon Arase, sorry, you have to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, Mr. Solomon Arase, we can hear you clearly.
Let me thank the convener for having me, and I have listened to the other panelists. This is a very topical issue that we've been dealing with in Nigeria for a very long time. let me align myself with my former minister, General Dambazo. The police in Nigeria is a creation of the colonial, administration. And the way it was structured, it was not structured along the line of the British police, the Metropolitan Police, as it were, that is supposed to be, rule of law compliant, very friendly. It was created because it was a wing of the political economy of, the colonialists. It was the presupposition that they had was the policing culture that they met when they came in, they felt was not civilized. They felt it was backward. They felt it was barbaric. So they had to impose theirs. And don't forget that when they came in, the indigenes actually resisted them because they felt that it was an instrument of coercion. It was an instrument of oppression, that it was meant to, put them in check and collect taxes to run the colonial administration. So the occupational culture of the police ab initio, from when it was brought into, most of the colonies, there was this suspicion between the members of, the people who they were supposed to govern and, the colonialists. A lot of people have argued that the British police that we know very much is community-based. They are the human rights, compliant. But that the one that they brought into most of the colonies was, the Irish model that was based on force, that was based on, intimidation and coercion. So most of the police force that they instituted in our country was the one that they used in, going into most of the communities and suppressing the people when they came in. And after independence, in 1960, just as General Dambazo said, we had an unbroken 28 years of military rule. And the political elites, instead of trying to reform the police that they inherited, they now saw that they were now transplanting the privileges of the colonialists to that of the political elites. So the police force was not actually reformed. And he also mentioned the Police Act, a section of it that actually gave the police, the Nigerian police, that they can also perform, military roles, even up till as we speak, in the northeast, where we are fighting issues of terrorism, the police is fighting side by side with the military. So you discover that, the social content of policing that is known, international best practices that is known, we've not been able to incorporate it into our policing culture in this country. When we now came out of the military rule in 1999, we were now confronted with a police force that was not well trained. They had institutional challenges. Their numeric strength was not enough to dominate the policing space. And it looks as if all hell was let loose. We started having issues of ethnic and religious discontent within the country. Issues with the Shagamu, we had the Shagamu riot, the OPC, we had these militant groups, OPC, fighting with the Hausa traders in Lagos. In the southeast, you have the Agulere bloodletting. That was very, very serious. The Kano and Kaduna, riots in 2000 was also a challenge to the Nigerian police force. Then in the Niger Delta, where the people were struggling for issues of resource control, that was, an issue that the police hadn't the capacity to actually deal with. And most of the political elites, paradoxically, we're now asking for, the military to come in and, and take over most of the responsibilities of, policing this crisis. So you discover that the political elites, even though they are products of, a political culture, a democratic political culture, they have not been able to actually believe that the police has to be reformed in line with, democratic culture and train them, equip them, to carry out that civil function. The general just mentioned, section 217 of, we have constitutional and legal provisions that says that the military can, assist the police in times of civil, disobedience. They've been doing that over time. But the question has always been, what is the exit strategy? Is it supposed to be perpetual, just as the topic is talking about? Is it a convenience or something that has become, a culture in our country? As at the last count, the military was already deployed in about 46 internal security areas in the country, carrying out what is supposed to be strictly policing functions. So people are asking, if you are able to maintain the peace, why can't you now return to your statutory responsibility? So that has been one challenge that we've been facing over the years. And the military has actually tried, because they have what they call in local balance operation second 11, where, when they have, during the military regime, when they had issues with, petroleum products, telecommunication, natural disasters, they are able to step in, in case there is a civil disobedience of the first 11, the civil servants, going on strike. They will go in and deal with the issues and now retreat to their statutory, responsibilities. But the problem has always been the question of overtime, of the military in civil, policing. And the effect of this has been, it erodes the confidence of the people in security agencies, because when you see military checkpoints across the length and breadth of the country, those things that we are complaining about the civil police, this same culture is now being, replicated by the military that we are supposed to have. And it also, induces multiple levels of security checks. So you discover that the Honorable Minister, when he was a minister, he tried to see whether he could harmonize these things, especially at the airports, where you have the Homeland Security model of, dealing with all these issues. Though his period was a bit short, so I'm sure he wanted, to do. So my own take in this issue is that, yes, some of the issues we have had to deal with have been outside, the capacity of the local police to deal with. But when the military, they come in, there must be an exit strategy. There must be a way, after dealing with the issue, because most of the places where they are presently involved, the issues they came to resolve, they've not been able to resolve them sufficiently well. And they are still there. So which means that we are now involved in, duplicity of functions of most of these our military institutions. I think I will stop there, and maybe during the question and answer sections, if there are gaps, that you want me to fill, I will be able to fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Thank you very much, the past Inspector General of Police, Mr. Solomon Arase. This is as much a conversation about here in Nigeria and as much a conversation on what is happening internationally. And so I would want to call on IGP Rupa Mudgil, who is an Indian Police Service Officer. She's currently the Inspector General of Police Railways in Bangalore, Karnataka. She was also posted as Additional Commandant General Home Guards and ex-officio Additional Director, Civil Defense, Commissioner for Traffic and Road Safety, and Deputy Inspector General of Prisons. She's an international motivational speaker on police reforms and upholding of ethics in the profession. You're welcome, IGP Rupa Mudgil.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this event. Thanks, General Salibala. Well, coming to the topic, today there's an increasing militarization of police the world over. It started with, let's say, the 9/11 incident or the reasons of terrorism and war against drugs in USA. But then most of the nations look up to USA, and it started almost in all countries, including every small nation. Today, you find that the police is highly militarized. And as it is, many of the developing nations, including India and Nigeria, were colonies of European powers. And therefore, there was always this we versus they mentality. There was always this ruler versus ruled. And added to this, now with the militarization, there is a warrior mentality. So before I speak on whether it is good, let me just say what, in my view, is militarization of the police. That is, as already a speaker said prior to me, adopting core military values, which also means adopting ways and means of military men. The military is trained to assault and annihilate the enemy. But here the police deals with not the enemy, but the civilians. They are our own citizens. And police is definitely not trained or should not be trained to assault and annihilate, but they must be trained to use weapons to prevent, to mitigate anybody else using the force. Now, having said that, there is an increase buying of military equipments by the police forces, the grenade launchers, the snipers, even machine guns, and so on. There is increased use of combat uniforms, and that is the face of militarization of a police force. So now that the police should actually adopt the guardian mentality, because we are the guardians for the citizens. We need to protect them. They are not our enemies. But with increasing funds being pumped into buying these equipments, what goes on? Is there a change in the mindset of the policeman? I think it does. Because when he's on the road, controlling rioters, facing the protesters, he has a wide range of choice. There is a continuum. One is talk to them, persuade them, prevent them from using force or further damaging anything. The other extreme of the continuum is using force, the police using force themselves against the protesters. Now, with the increasing military equipments and mindset being pumped in the police force, the policeman on the road thinks that it is okay for him, it's all right for him to use the military ways. It is okay for him to use the lethal weapons. And how justified is he? Because the civilian is unarmed, he doesn't possess lethal weapons, but then the cop becomes trigger happy, and therefore it is definitely not justified. Also, from a civilian point of view, if I am a civilian, which I'm not, actually I'm a cop, but if I were just a civilian, would I approach such a police force? Would I approach them with the complaints? No, I would get scared. I would be running for cover at the sight of the policeman. Now, as it is all over the world, police suffers from a damage to their repute of not being so fair and of being tyrannical. Now, in India, for example, the mothers put their small children to sleep by saying, if you don't listen to me, if you don't have this dish, if you don't sleep in time, I will call the police. So this being the case, with the increasing use of military ways and means in the police force, are we not alienating our own people? Will they come to us for complaints? Even if a civilian is victimized to the greatest extent by another civilian, he will never come to the police if he sees police as tyrannical, more, and therefore, for public being our clients, we again with the increasing militarization. And therefore, I believe that military ways and means should be sparingly used and should not be regularly used. Now, to give just a small context with reference to India, we have three things. We have the military, we have the police force, but in between, there is something called the paramilitary force. That is the policemen actually adopting the ways and means of police. Now, the paramilitary forces are with the federal government at the center, and the police force is a state subject as per the constitution. They come under the local government purview. So when there is distrust, when there is a riot, and when people themselves think that the local police will not act in all fairness, then there is a voice to give it to the paramilitary. So by doing that, I think somewhere we have cut at our own roots. So the need is to invest more in the police force, in the local police force, to strengthen the civil police force, rather than adopting or giving the situation to be handled to the military, or to bring in more military men into the police force, which is also one way of militarization. I think these are best avoided. I think I'll take questions later. So with these, I thought I'll be brief and yeah. So
Thank you very much, IGP Rupa, for being very brief and succinct. Your points are very well made and very well taken. I would want to call on Dr. Tony Hastrop now for her presentation. Dr. Hani Hastrop joined the University of Stirling in July 2019 as senior lecturer in international politics. She is a graduate of the University of California, the University of Cape Town, and the University of Edinburgh. She previously held positions at the University of Warwick and Kent. Her current research examines the implementation practices of the Women, Peace and Security agenda at regional levels and its implications in the global South. Dr. Hastrop, we've been having this conversation for a few minutes now. We've looked at the what of militarization of policing. We've looked at the why of it. We've even had people talk about the how of it. Is there something missing from this conversation? And what is it? Are we asking the right questions?
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you to General Bala for the invitation to speak today, and colleagues from WISER for organizing. It's certainly very much a privilege to be among experts this afternoon, but I should say ahead of time in case I get caught out. I'm in central Scotland and it's quite windy, so my internet seems to be going in and out. What I wanted to speak about this afternoon is to sort of draw on some of my experiences of researching policing, but from the perspective of security sector reform training programs, particularly those of the EU. And here I sort of draw on my research background using gender lenses and thinking through how security sector reform support programs articulate the gendered natures of increased militarizations, particularly in regional contexts. As a Nigerian, I also reflect, of course, on my own personal experiences of living in country, but I'm very much, again, speaking from the perspective of someone who studies this, who draws on feminist theorizing. So in the context of my own work, when I think about militarization, I always start from the idea, I think of militarization as a set of practices, and I think that the previous scholars have described this quite well. So as a scholar, my starting point is, what kind of drives these practices? And for that, I go to the literature, particularly the definition that David Kinsella gives for militarism, where he talks about it as a disposition or proclivity to behave in particular ways by employing military over non-military means of conflict resolution. Feminist scholarship has been quite resistant to militarism because many feminists see militarism as an ideology that supports military values. So it's not just about the mechanisms or the practices. And because this ideology can be quite pervasive and tends to reproduce problematic hegemonic masculinities, scholars like Cynthia Enloe militarization, so the process through which this ideology is enacted, as being a process that can be quite easily legitimized, often quite popular, and gains elite acceptance. And I think that this is very important because often, as we've seen, the militarization doesn't just come out of the blue. It has to be accepted by certain parts of society. And I think it's also important to say that, militarization of the police isn't just confined to the police structures themselves. So militarism and the militarization in particular is multi-stranded process and roots this ideology in society. But militarization is not inevitable. And although militarization characterizes a lot of security interventions, both within country and internationally, what I think is perhaps quite challenging is the fact that it's often quite mundane. It's very much wrapped up in the mundanity of law and order, which is often implemented by the police. So as another feminist, Linda O'Hell notes, feminist interventions into militarizations actually allow us to see how embedded these everyday practices are. In the global south, where I'm located, there's a certain acceptance of militarism as an ideology and an acceptance of militarism to be applied elsewhere. And this is where for me, I sort of see this process in the security sector. Oftentimes, the EU's engagement, which is the area in which I work, is very much in Africa. And for that reason, I sort of look at these two contexts. Across the African continent, then, we know that different African countries have varying histories of civilian training that is supposed to engender more democratic police forces. However, the training that focuses on reforming the security sector so that it engenders democratic principles, including liberal rights, are also products of coloniality. And I think the previous speakers have described that very clearly as to why this coloniality persists. This coloniality, however, is characterized by what I would call racial hierarchies, as much in the past as well as in the present, and if we're not careful in the future. And these racial hierarchies have gendered implications, which epitomize the sort of challenges that have already been described, and I would characterize them as challenges of burst of hegemonic masculinities. And I'll come back to this. So if you sort of think about who is the recipient of policing, and we look at it in historical context, and I'm not going to cover that ground anymore, we see that oftentimes the people who are most, the recipients who are most disadvantaged of the current militaristic practices are majority populations in terms of the globe, but often minoritized in the global north. And when we look in the global south, is also other minoritized individuals, whether because of ethnic group, gender, age, disability, and so on. So militarization suggests an escalation from the status quo. But actually, if we look historically, as has been carefully described, I would argue that the process of militarization for the majority of the world started well before 9/11. What 9/11 has done is it has shone a light on the everyday suffering and the very pernicious impacts of this militarized practices. And so I actually would say that in a way, whereas the ideology of militarism persists, it might be useful if we're thinking of a way forward to think more of our current situation as being one in which martial politics actually governs our current security framework. Martial politics, as opposed to militarization, would suggest that there is no, when we talk about militarization, we seem to suggest that there was a before, and then after 9/11, certain things happened. Whereas we know that historically, for people who are located in the so-called global south and for minoritized people who are located in the global north, life has more or less continued the same, especially when we're looking at the relationship between the police and the people. Militarization is often described in a way that sets it as exceptional, whereas I would argue that it's not actually exceptional. And indeed, the governance of the security sphere in Africa, but also the security sphere for a lot of people who are minoritized all over the world, is one that is embedded in martial politics. And I think it's important then to highlight that thinking about policing, it's not useful to think about policing as an individual acts, but to think of it as structural. The danger then that we face is perhaps that there are more obvious implications of hegemonic masculinities that reproduce hierarchies in the everyday practices of security actors. So the structure informs the practices of individuals. A lot of times, these activities in the scenario of martial politics allow state security actors to legitimize dominant and masculinized positions, which can only function by the subordination or feminization of the population. In a way, what is refracted back to us now, so what we see now as an increase in militarization, or what we describe as such, is the consequence of the resistance rather than the outcome of militarism itself. This has been with us for a while. And I think this is one of the things that was highlighted by the tragic murder of Mr. George Floyd in the United States. So, sort of thinking in the context of the work that I've been doing and also reading a lot, particularly in 2020, because I do think that we're now at a critical juncture, I'm forced to think, so what do we do about it now? I don't necessarily have the answers. However, I would say in the context of the work that I'm researching right now, there are two discourses that have emerged as possible answers to dealing with this condition of martial politics, or what some people might describe as increasing militarization. The first is reform. In the global north, especially where I'm located, this refrain comes a lot from politicians and other types of elites, and oftentimes is amenable to some parts of the policing forces. The challenge of reform, however, is that it doesn't necessarily change the status quo for a lot of minoritized people in the global north, but also people in the global south, mainly because we have been talking about reform for a very long time. Now, I should say, this is partly because reform lends itself to, again, certain fixed mechanisms. So there haven't necessarily been alternative forms of reform that has been thought of. In the global south in particular, I think that when I think of the global south and the recipients of policing, their lives aren't necessarily going to change. After all, a lot of formal training related to security sector reform programs include modules on human rights, the importance of gender, which unfortunately also sort of exist alongside the defining of certain security practices, which both government and elites suggest to us require exceptional interventions, some of which have already been spoken of. In Africa, oftentimes this has to do with counterterrorism. It has to do not just with counterterrorism, but also organized crime. And more recently, particularly when we're looking at the EU's relationship with a lot of African countries, particularly in West Africa, having to do with curbing irregular migration. Reform, unfortunately, discursively tends to be business as usual within the existing global hierarchies that I've already spoken of. And here again, I'm focusing on the mechanisms, not necessarily the people. But unfortunately, the mechanisms sort of reinforce the structures. The second discourse that has emerged although I should say this hasn't really been a focus in official circles until recently, has been the discourse around abolition. Professor Angela Davis calls abolition a feminist strategy. This idea moves away from militarization in that it re-envisions what security means and considers who security is for. In that way, we move away from the focus on state security, which of course is already been articulated in concepts such as human security. But abolition calls for us to go beyond this. Abolition is certainly not about maintaining the status quo, and it calls on societies as a whole to think about how to rethink what law, order, and governance means when it is not propped up by hierarchies that are dependent on marginalization. In this scenario, the current police will also have a say in what abolition might be. These two propositions are not always considered whether reform, substantive reform, or abolition, but in 2020, we are thinking about what reform in the colloquial might mean, whether this is closer to what some abolitionists want or whether it's totally out of kilter with anything that can be achieved. What in my mind is clear about the current moment is that certainly the fact that we're having a conversation around militarization would suggest that this current moment in history is disruptive and also provides the opportunity for society to reject living with the forced choice of thinking about policing and militarization as either a necessity or a convenience. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Tony Hastrop, for that intervention. Like I said before you spoke, we have been talking for about an hour, 15 minutes now, about the what of militarization of policing in terms of military values adopted, ways and means adopted, even in some countries, even military fatigue being used by police. Well, we talked about the why, and some speakers talked to the rise of crime and criminality, and such as countering terrorism as the why of militarization of policing. We spoke about the how, is experienced in the use of excessive force and other means engaging with the civilian populace. And, you quite, Dr. Tony brought out for us at the end of this conversation, the for who, and, through questions around, the vulnerable and minority groups, how they have historically been treated and how, this is replication of structures that are already on ground in the way that minority groups and the vulnerable are treated in society. And so this brings us to the end of the presentation by the speakers. And for our next session, we have a lineup of panelists who are going to take up some of these presentations that have been made. They're going to throw questions, they're going to shed more light, and they're going to engage us for the next few minutes before we open up for discussion. I'd like to emphasize that the chat is open, and I'd also want to draw the attention of the panelists to the chat. There are quite specific questions that are being asked of the panelists, and I'd like to draw your attention to that. So you can go to the question and answer section, you can go to the chat section, and you can engage the attendees on some of the questions that they are asking. So we're having this conversation both with voice and with chat, please. So thank you once again to our distinguished speakers. Thank you for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for the rich conversation we've had so far. And I would like to turn to our panelists now. Unfortunately, our first panelist, who was supposed to have joined us, is not available. So we're going to start with Dr. Adedeji Ebo. Dr. Adedeji Ebo is with the United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs. He's the Chief Conventional Arms Branch. He was until then the pioneer chief of the Security Sector Reform Unit, Office of the Rule of Law and Security Institution, Department of Peace Operations, New York. He's also served as Director of Political Affairs at the United Nations Office for West Africa and the Sahel, UNOWAS, United Nations Operation in Côte d'Ivoire, and the United Nations Office in Mali. His latest publication is The United Nations and Security Sector Reform, Policy and Practice. Dr. Adedeji Ebo, you're welcome to the conversation today. Please, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes, and I would be a bit strict with the timing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and hello to everyone. I'm delighted to be part of this panel, and I thank my good friend, General Sali Bala, for inviting me to participate. Let me first say that I speak only for myself, not for the United Nations, partly because in my 12 years as Chief of the Security Sector Reform Unit, I haven't had the opportunity that I wanted to talk about my own country in Nigeria. So I'm going to take the 5 minutes opportunity and to actually protest a little bit that even if you gave me an hour, it wouldn't be enough because there's a lot to say. I think much of what needs to be said has been well said by the previous, by the speakers. And I want to actually lean on what has been said to say that, the entire use of military tools, military analysis, military weapons, military ethos, applying that to civilian policing functions is a global phenomenon. But at the end of the day, the analysis has to be local because security is a very personal, very, very local issue. And to say that broadly for the so-called established democracies, reform could work because the pillars of their security institutions are established. But I like to very much agree with the last speaker that what we need in what has been rightly called post-colonial societies is not reform, it is transformation. And what do I mean? What do I mean by transformation? I think we have to ask ourselves, if you look at the vernacular of security discussion in West Africa, the vernacular of security governance, you hear the Yorubas in Western Nigeria refer to the police as Olokpa. In Hausa, we say Dansanda. This means the man with the stick. I imagine originally modeled after the British Bobby, as they call him. But in West Africa and other parts of Africa, what was done with the stick was a very different thing. If you go beyond Nigeria and you go to, say, Togo and Ghana, the same expression. In Ewe, the police is called Bovi. Again, the man with the stick. So this reminds me of a very interesting quote by a distinguished Nigerian professor, Professor Okudiba Nnoli, which has always intrigued me in all my years in this work. And I quote, he said, "Security seems to have acquired a mystique. In the minds of most people, it has become mystical, mythical, even mysterious." So the point I'm trying to make is that security sector reform and security conversation generally is not yet, it's not yet the conversation of the people. It is a conversation of the specialists like ourselves. It's a conversation of the United Nations, but I'm still trying to translate security sector reform into Hausa or Yoruba. And until we are able to go beyond the inheritance and to unpack our colonial inheritance, we will be in a situation where my colleague from India said the police is often an instrument of coercion, which is reflected in being called dansanda or lopa. So let me focus very quickly and speedily on what then do we need to do? I think we have done a lot of diagnosis. What do we need to do? I think the first thing we need to do is to engage what Professor Nolly talked about the abracadabra of security, and to demystify the security sector. And by which I mean, having inherited this colonial, whatever it is, have we then transformed the inheritance? Both the former IGP and my former boss, General Dambasawa, when we were at NDA, made the very important point about how we seem to be stuck in that colonial space. We have done a lot of reforms without transformation. How do we transform? I think we need to ask ourselves, as Nigerians, as Africans, some basic questions that I think, despite our constitutions, despite the reforms, are yet to be fully asked. What are the threats that we face? Which institutions do we need to address these threats? We need the police for law enforcement. We need the military for fighting our enemies outside the borders. What are the relationships between these institutions? How do we pay for these institutions? And very importantly, how do we guard the guardians? If we arm the police to protect us, how do we make sure that they remain under the control of the people? These are questions that we need, I believe, to ask to ourselves as societies. I was reminded recently when I think it's called the Western Nigeria Security Network, otherwise known as Amotekun, was being discussed. I was reminded that, honestly, we have not really fully asked ourselves these questions. And because we have not, we keep coming back to what are foundational questions that we are yet to pose. Now, in terms of what we need to do, I would say that apart from unpacking our colonial inheritance, we need also to recognize the complexity of the security challenges that we face today. And these threats that we face have been well enumerated by the previous speakers. When law enforcement, when the challenges to internal security are such that they threaten the territorial integrity of the country, the police is not enough. What is important is that in collaboration between the police and the military, when the military come to aid civilian authority, the rules of engagement should be clear. The division of labor should be clear. Because when you apply military solutions to civilian problems, what happens is that the citizens do not feel safer. Actually, they feel more threatened. The other thing that we need to do is, in answering the question of who guards the guardians, we need to have the legislature play its role of oversight. I would have liked to see a parliamentarian, for example, on this panel, because they are the ones who are the voice of the people and should be able to, through the various committees, ensure effective oversight of the security institutions. And we can come to that later. We also need to involve more centrally civil society in taking up these issues. Unfortunately, because of military rule, many civilians see security as not a subject for general discussion. This is part of the militarization we are talking about. So that after we're able to achieve the end of military rule, then we down the tools. I think we need to take up again the issue of security sector governance and the engagement of civil society in that. Next, I think we need to ensure citizen participation through basic civic education. If a policeman slaps you or abuses your human rights, do you know where to go? Do you know what to do? We need to educate our citizens in terms of their rights and how they can, get justice if they are at the receiving end of militarized policing. Also, I think it's about time that we popularize the studying of security sector governance in our tertiary institutions. I'm aware of so many universities out there, but in what my colleague called the Northern Hemisphere, studying security governance, we should have Nigerian universities, African universities, having security governance as an intrinsic part of their curriculum. There's a lot that's out there. A lot has been done. You have the ECOWAS Code of Conduct for Armed Forces and Security Services. You have the ECOWAS Security Sector Governance Framework. You have the African Union Security Sector Policy Framework. United Nations has an entire resolution on security sector reform called Resolution 2151. But we need to domesticate, digest, internalize these global norms that are being recommended. Lastly, I would like to say that please let us use COVID-19 as an opportunity. Now that this global pandemic has also led to a global pandemonium where everybody is running to their own corner of the world. I think in some corners of the world, it's about time to pose those big questions to ourselves that I raised earlier on. And I would like to say that I'm very happy that WISA under General Bala Saleh has put this on the table. But to say that this, for me, is just the beginning of the conversation. After the global manifestations, please, let's have the regional manifestations. Let's study the national manifestations because ultimately security is local. Thank you. That's my little contribution.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ebo, for that contribution. And I particularly would like to highlight your point about the kind of conversation that we've been having, that we need to have a people's conversation. I think this point is also re-echoed. I've seen one of the attendees, asking the question about how or what kind of policing do people want? Is our government interested in knowing what kind of policing people want? And how do we engage that conversation? Thank you so much for your points. Next, I would like to call on Dr. Chris Kwaja for his intervention. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at the Center for Peace and Security, Modibo Adama University of Technology. He serves as a senior advisor Nigeria to the United States Institute of Peace, with the mandate to provide strategic advice and grow UCIT's work in Nigeria and the broader Lake Chad Basin area. In 2018, he was appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council as African representative on the United Nations Working Group on Mercenaries. Chris has over 70 scholarly, technical, and policy publications to his credit in books, monographs, series, and technical reports, and security briefs, among others. Dr. Chris Kwaja, please, your intervention in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine and General Bala, for the opportunity to engage on this discussion. And I think, yes, there is a global manifestation of the militarization of policing in the context of what we see happening on the global scale. But are there specific local experiences that helps us understand the linkage between the local specificities of the manifestation of militarization on one hand, and the dynamics we see across the world in terms of many of the activities or many of the kind of policy regimes that we see both at the level of states and supranational entities that is informing this kind of discussion. And I'm raising this because of the point Dr. Adedeji just raised about many of the policies. There are many hundreds of policy prescriptions out there for countries to domesticate. How many of such have been domesticated? And I think I'm raising this in the context of what we need to appreciate in terms of, one, the place of institutions in militarization, and two, the psychology of an average policeman and an average citizen on the same issue of militarization. In 2002, the former Inspector General of Police, Tafa Balogun, when he was appointed IGP, his vision was christened Operation Fire for Fire, and it was celebrated. Now, what was the import of an Operation Fire for Fire vision in a country just like Nigeria, where the police is supposed to be the most civil institution, the closest to Nigerians, and supposed to also provide the kind of safety that Nigerians deserve in terms of public safety and security? But what we saw with such a declaration was that the vision was purely a declaration of war against Nigerian citizens, and it ended up emboldening the police in their attempt to use maximum force against both criminals and law-abiding citizens alike. One of the key backlash of that is the whole question of a mindset or psyche of a policing that makes the police think and act like soldiers, and increasingly, relationship between the police and the citizens take this form of a warlike posture, because an average citizen an average policeman sees the citizen as an enemy of the state, and an average citizen sees the police as an agent of the state that is out to crush them. And back to what colonialism did to us in terms of demilitarization of policing. Two things. By design, and the point was already made, that the police was not even established by the colonial government to protect citizens, but it was established to crush, to enforce law and order. The second thing that colonialism did, which was profound and which we still maintain today, is the separation of the police from the citizens in the context of the establishment of police barracks. Police barracks were not established because the police needed accommodation. It was established because there was a deliberate need to separate the citizens from the police. And you take an example of your dog. Most of the dogs that we keep under lock and key and separate from people within the house tend to be more wild, because their relationship with people on a daily basis is not frequent. So they see every visitor as an intruder. And because we already have that in our psychology, or in our psyche, that there is that separation that is institutionalized between the police and the citizens on a daily basis, we see repression, we see violation of human rights, we see the police doing more in terms of what in their name is called the Nigerian police force, which on a normal day, the force should not even be there, but we see them engaging citizens in a very fierce manner. And that on its own is a major challenge that an average citizen is forced to deal with. Now, what do we do? What are some of the key pathways to demilitarization of the police? We need to really come back to the drawing board as citizens of this country, as citizens of the world, to say, in the context of law and order and public safety, what are those primary functions that the police should do? And when these functions go beyond the police, who does that? Because I remember Nigeria here, the reason why the MOPOL was established, it was because there was a need to ensure that the police, the regular police, does not adopt this very militarized posture in dealing with citizens. So there was a MOPOL, a mobile police force that was out to provide that support in terms of dealing with issues of criminality and other forms of crimes. But today, MOPOL has been moved to IP protection, and where you have the very little number of police on ground, they are just out there, not even equipped, and the few that have AK-47 are even out to really use it against the citizens rather than even protecting the citizens. The second point about whether reform or transformation, something should be done. And I agree with Dr. Ebo that we should be talking about a more structured transformation of policing. And I think we must dismantle the walls that separate the police from the people. When you travel across outside Nigeria, in many of these countries, you discover that there are no police barracks. Your next door neighbor is a policeman, and he deals with you with the civility and respect that is required because he's your neighbor. But where it takes me 30 minutes to look for the police, to report a simple case to the police comes in as a visitor. He comes in as a stranger to the very individuals whose taxes are used to provide him with all the basic resources that he needs. And I think for me, this level of transformation or reform by government, it's something that we must be able to push and ensure that that whole bridge that exists between the police and the citizens is blocked. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chris Kwaja, for that presentation. We are having, this is as much as you say, a global conversation as it is a local and context-specific conversation, globalized in the way that it is presented, but contextualized in the solutions. And I think that the idea that you give, about the closeness of the police to the people is a fantastic one. Thank you once again. And quickly now, I'm going to call on Dr. Max Downs from the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. He's the head of DCAF's Operations Department. Dr. Max Downs, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to join you this afternoon and to meet many old friends and colleagues. Let me thank General Salabala for pulling together such an impressive line of speakers. And we at DCAF are obviously very happy to be associated with this very important discussion. As Dr. Ibo had mentioned, this session comes at a very tumultuous time of change. The COVID-19 crisis has resulted in many security providers, military and police, being called upon to carry out tasks that are normally outside of their mandate, their roles and their responsibilities. And in tandem, in many countries, we are seeing our TV screens filled with images of police responding to peaceful protesters with violence or responding to crimes with disproportionate force. But yet, when we look at these two crises that are affecting our societies today, and we also see a lot of the key challenges that are being proposed by this panel. And for us here at DCAF, one of the main lessons that we've seen is the importance of trust between the security forces and the population that they're meant to serve. For police, trust is at the center of their ability to perform their mandate, and the militarization of policing is just one challenge facing policing today. Issues of representation, inclusiveness, accountability, as was mentioned previously, and the ability to respond to social change are all critical policing. For the purposes of my intervention, I'm going to refer back to some of the other speakers and the issues that they dealt with, but I'd like to emphasize three issues. The first is, what are the driving forces behind the militarization of police, both as an institution and as the General mentioned previously, also as a function. The second are, what are the consequences of this? And here I'd like to highlight the need for proper analysis, SOPs, and most importantly, effective management and accountability of the police. And the third, I'd like to just briefly touch upon what role does international police assistance play in this process. So for me, the key question when it comes to the militarization of police is, in what context, for what purpose, and if we recognize that in certain circumstances it is indeed necessary, what accountability measures do we need to put in place? But it is important to note, as the background paper to this panel has, and as many speakers previously have also mentioned, that police forces, as we know them today, were created out of military structures, created as a means of coercing or controlling a population, whether they were a colonial police force or tools of an autocratic state. So they were developed in many cases under concepts of military doctrine, and it's only as democracy developed that we saw a move towards more civilian institutions. But let me highlight maybe four reasons, or put on the table 4 reasons behind the militarization of policing for our discussion. The first of which, obviously, there are many different factors around this, and some of them are contextual and some of them are more systemic. But in many cases, militarization is as a result of political capture of policing institutions. There are examples here in Europe, and there's examples in Africa as well, where the operational autonomy of police is curtailed or dictated by political forces who want to and demand strong responses to dissent and a show of zero tolerance. In other cases, militarization of the police is due to an overwhelming security crisis, and this was mentioned previously by others, whether it's drug trafficking, organized crime, or terrorism. And this can often tilt the balance for police, where they focus more on the security aspect of their mandate to the detriment of their justice role as keepers of the peace or gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. And when people try to justify the militarization of policing, it's rarely in the context of the traditional role of policing, but usually in the context of either counterterrorism or the increasing violence associated with some forms of criminality. And it's the growth of this counterterrorism narrative that has muddied the policy concepts around policing. And, whereas others have rightly depicted the response to the war on terror, the increase of availability of military-style equipment, training and tactics, the role of masculinities, all of this has contributed to the more militarized approach of policing. But I'd also like to highlight, as General and Dambazo mentioned, that it's not only a trend of the militarization of the police as an institution, but equally militarizing the police as a function through the creation of other institutions, in many cases military institutions, that take on public security roles. But the decision to militarize the police comes with very negative negative side effects. So there's, and here again, IGP Roper mentioned this quite well, there's a marked difference in the doctrinal and training regimes of the military as opposed to a police officer. Military officers are trained to detect threats and eliminate these threats with the use of lethal force. But police officers are trained to exert force through models of proportional or rational use of force, and the basis of which is always to cause as little damage as possible to control the situation. They work with the citizens who may become criminal violators, but they never see them as their enemy. The issues of the type of weaponry that the police are now utilizing and how, in many cases, I think as Dr. Ebo mentioned, the deployment of this type of military-grade equipment in cities and towns can actually generate perceptions of insecurity and unease amongst the population. Dr. Ebo also mentioned that military forces are often ill-equipped to assume functions where community engagement or transformation of a conflictual situation are the focus. And more often than not, when military forces are given public order responsibilities, the resources of police forces are generally reduced, leaving the funds available for modernization or transformation, as was mentioned, somewhat limited. The role of the international community is worth mentioning, and whilst Commissioner Carrillo, the UN police advisor, mentioned that the UN is focusing on developing of international standards for civilian policing, and this is absolutely critical, donors often play a role in supporting more robust approaches, which, while necessary in certain contexts, put a focus more on the robust approaches and have to be balanced with more complementary focus on enhancing security and justice for the vast majority of the population who may have different security needs than, say, the international community. So let me just wrap up by saying what can be done. I think it's important to remember that the police are a reflection of society, and the militarization of police often follows the militarization of society. And it's important to make a distinction here between the militarization of the police on one side, and the development of policing tactics that are just ill-suited and not proportional to the threats they face. These are two separate different issues. And so for me, the key issues are proportionality and accountability. These are, of course, instances where robust tactics are needed and when the context requires, but by and large, the vast majority of the population requires a civilian police with traditional policing tactics. Where hard tactics or equipment are required, they need to be ring-fenced, deployed with caution, only after clear SOPs are put in place, only where the management of the police is enhanced and decision-making supported, and where robust accountability structures, both internal and external, are in place to review their use. Because militarization comes at a cost for the police, not least as regards the availability of resources. But for example, for patrol officers, community policing is a fairly stable set of skills. How to treat people with respect does not require continuous updating. But the development of military tactics and training and their infusion across the police require continuous updating. Procurement, maintenance, and certification of officers on the equipment comes at a cost. And what is clear is that this trend has moved the police away from the idea of a service, away from policing by consent, and reinforces the sense of the police as a coercive force. And in a number of countries, the traditional mandate of policing, including public order maintenance, crime prevention, and crime investigation, has been expanded beyond its original mandate. And it's been expanded to compensate for shortcomings in the political and economic models in social services or civic engagement. And whilst also tackling new forms of insecurity through organized crime, terrorism. So part of the answer has to be a deeper examination of the causes of violence in society. And in some cases, militarization and repressive tactics are partly in response to rising levels of violence. But this creates a spiral of meeting increased violence with increased violence, and this can be hard to step out of. So the trend towards militarization is one of those challenges facing policing today. And as I mentioned, for me, the answer is proportionality and accountability, a focus on the police's role as a justice provider as well as a security provider, and the need to focus on the reinforcement of management capacity within policing structures to ensure where it's necessary to deploy these tactics, that they are done so with caution and with accountability. And let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark Downs, for your presentation and for those very useful points on proportionality and accountability. I also like your point about the cost of militarization of the police, both to the police itself and to the citizens. I think that somebody mentioned earlier that there hasn't been nearly enough research, that shows if the is yielding results or is just making things worse, like you said about violence, increase in violence met by more violence, and then the cycle repeats itself. I will turn over now to Kemi Okenyedo, who has been working with the police in Nigeria, ensuring police accountability. To make her presentation, she is the Executive Director of the Rule of Law and Empowerment Initiative, also known as Partners West Africa, Nigeria, and has over 15 years of experience in justice and security sector reform issues. Ms. Kemi Okenyedo, your presentation, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. I'll speak briefly from the angle of looking at the fact that even our politics has been militarized. I mean, looking at Nigerian politics from the time we have just, we went into civil rule. I think that was like the 99 till date. We've had two presidents with military background. And if you look across the political parties, you have a lot of the retired military officers being card-carrying member and active participants in the space of politics right now. So I would first start from the fact that even our politics is militarized. And from that lens, you look at the activities of the security and law enforcement agencies. And when we talk about militarization of the police, first also would look at it from the point of view of the military itself encroaching in policing space. And I'll be drawing examples from what we see in-house. In agree to parameters of what needs to take place and what should be in place for each other, for them to, for the police to take over. It seems like there's always seems to be a stumbling block put before the police in order for them to move forward in that space. And we see the activities of development partners within, and I'm saying this within the context of the Northeast, that rather than come in and support existing structures and strengthen the structures for the structures to work effectively, they're coming in and setting up their own structures that are more militarized in operations. So there's been some discussions about a specialized police force that would go into that would be the bridge between the military and the police in the Northeast, particularly in Borno State. And like Chris said, one of the questions some of us keep asking is what has happened to the mobile police force? Why is it that the investment is not being made in the mobile police force or even within special units of the police to be able to perform this function? The legal framework of the police. This has been a challenge, and I think General Dambasau also alluded to this about the functions of the police, of the police within the Police Act having a bit of militarized content. But luckily for us, I would say last week or about 2 weeks back, we've been able to, the National Assembly has passed the new police reform bill. The police reform bill, as it is now, is looking at the police being more of a justice and a public safety security agency and less of a militarized agency. The question we ask is, will this bill get assent from the president? Also looking at the background, which I alluded to initially, about the militarization of our political space and the understanding of the fact that the police need to be civil, the police need to be a public safety security agency with the full support of the arms of government and fully funded to be able to perform its operations and its mandates and be able to fuel the public confidence of Nigerians and citizens to support even the government at the end of the day. We talk about community policing and all the talk about community policing over the years not enshrined or governed by any legal framework. So this, the bill provides the opportunity for this. Finally, I'll be talking about accountability. And I think Mark also raised this. When we're talking about militarization, convenience or not, or a necessity or convenience, I think it's both for us in Nigeria. Yes, we have the issues of the new trends and patterns of criminality and insecurity that we have across the country. However, if you're fully prepared for it and we're fully invested in the architecture that exists, tweaking it to be able to address the needs of the people that is on ground, because I think Adeji also raised this, that policing at the end of the day is local. So all the frameworks, all the policy documents at the continental and at the international level, when they even come down, and even if it's domesticated by National Assembly, still needs to get to the grassroots. And how does it get to the grassroots? I think it's that missing gap that is making us see the evolution of non-state or informal policing actors or hybrid policing actors, with the ones we're seeing with the state governors coming up with their own mechanisms to address these issues. My final point would be on the length of women, peace and security, and the fact that as long as the structure that we're putting in place is not inclusive, and we're not looking at a system that addresses all facets of the society, there would still be a gap, and we would still need to come back to the table for further discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kemi, for your views and for sharing from your experience, and also for contextualizing this conversation in the way that society also presents itself, not just the militarization of the police, but also the fact that it seems society itself, is sort of militarized. And so some of these things have also become normalized, for us. Thank you once again. I would like to quickly call on our next speaker, who is Andres Perez. He's from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. He was a field investigator in Yemen, Somalia, and Afghanistan with the conflict armaments research, and he has made a number of publications, including Al-Shabaab stopped targeting civilians. Has Al-Shabaab stopped targeting civilians in Kenya? I'd like to invite him now to make his own presentation, please. Andres Perez, thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for that warm welcome, and thank you especially to General Balla and to White Ink and DCAF and the other organizers for having me here today. What I've come to do is discuss with you a little bit about international norms and standards on the use of force by law enforcement officials. And I think we've discussed many instances where, in a discrete context, perhaps it is necessary for the police to use military equipment or military tactics. We've also discussed or are aware of instances where it may be equally necessary for the armed forces to assist the police in law enforcement operations, perhaps because of personnel gaps. But I would suggest that regardless of the circumstances, it is absolutely necessary for us to anchor ourselves on international norms and standards so that regardless of the fluctuation or the mission creep, we don't end up in a free-for-all where human rights fall by the wayside. And shall I operate my own PowerPoint, or will the organizers be doing that? I can share my screen. Thank you. So armed forces and the policing of assemblies, that's a really important area where we want to make sure that we are abiding by international norms and standards. As many of our distinguished speakers have mentioned, the armed forces do not have the training or the equipment or the institutional culture, perhaps, that lends itself to a policing operation, particularly one where we're discussing about policing assemblies. And what I've done for you here today is to put together a PowerPoint presentation, which is annotated. I can't help myself. I'm a lawyer, so I've sourced all of my assertions. And I'd also love for you to go to have this with you for any further work you do or any other discussions. So the United Nations has stated quite unequivocally that armed forces assistance in law enforcement operations should be the exception and not the rule, for the reasons we've discussed about that difference in institutional culture. And that's something that's stated quite clearly in a joint report by two special rapporteurs, the rapporteur on the right to peaceful assembly and the rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions. Now, recognizing that there are exceptional circumstances where this might be necessary, it's really, really important to stand by a fundamental tenet, and that is that when the armed forces assist in law enforcement operations, they may have their uniform on, they may have been trained as armed forces, but in that context, they are law enforcement officers. And this is the paradigm shift that is available in international law, and which I would suggest, and OHCHR would suggest, is crucial to avoiding a lot of the violations and concerns that many of our distinguished panelists and speakers have raised today. And that is enshrined in the same report I mentioned, and also in a fundamental bedrock document on the use of force and the code of conduct by law enforcement officials, which I have for you right there. When law enforcement is assisted by the armed forces, they must abide by a series of requirements so that that assistance is lent in the context of law enforcement. There should be civilian control. I believe it was Dr. Ebo who very rightly pointed out the necessity of this. They must be, because they're law enforcement officers, then necessarily they are no longer operating under an armed conflict paradigm. It's the law enforcement paradigm, and therefore they are subject to international norms and standards on the use of force by law enforcement officers, which is different and focuses very importantly on a differentiated use of force, de-escalation, and the sort of approach that is key to safeguarding that relationship between the state and its citizens and ensuring that the citizens feel through the actions of law enforcement that they're being protected and not treated as an enemy. And to carry this out, it's important that the armed forces, when they're assisting, are fully trained in these law enforcement tactics of de-escalation, and quite importantly, that they're provided with the equipment to implement that differentiated use of force. Because it's one thing to ask an individual to police an assembly when all that is available to him or her is a baton, and then when things escalate beyond the utility of the baton, the next thing available is an assault rifle. There's no spectrum there for differentiated use of force, so therefore it's key to have provision of these less lethal weapons and ammunition, which I think Dr. Downs mentioned in the context of procurement.